Welcome everybody to the latest event sponsored by the Peoria Area World Affairs Council. I would like to take an opportunity to welcome our distinguished guest, Nina Jankowicz, and Don Sanford. Let you know that Don Sanford is going to be our moderator this evening. He is past president of the World Affairs Council and the current co-chair of the programming committee. It was his invitation that brought us our distinguished guest tonight. You are invited, as always, to submit questions via the chat button, and we'll get to those after our guest makes her prepared comments. With that, allow me to introduce her. Nina Jankowicz studies the intersection of democracy and technology in Central and Eastern Europe at the Wilson Center. She is author of How to Lose the Information War, Russia, Fake News, and the Future of Conflict. A good read, and I encourage you all to pick it up. Her writing has been published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and other sources. She's a frequent television and radio commentator on disinformation and Russia and East European affairs. You may have seen her recently on the PBS NewsHour or heard her on NPR. Ms. Jankowicz has advised the Ukrainian government on strategic communications under the auspices of a Fulbright Clinton Public Policy Fellowship. Prior to her Fulbright grant in Ukraine, Ms. Jankowicz managed democracy assistance programs to Russia and Belarus at the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs. She received her Master of Arts in Russian, Eurasian, and East European Studies at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service and her bachelor's from Bryn Mawr College. Welcome, Ms. Jankowicz, and take it away.
Well,
thank you.
I had mentioned we'll probably just go ahead and get started with the questions, so I didn't have her get prepared for the comments. So,
okay.
But I told her the thing I'm going to do first is, though, I really am promoting her book. If you have not purchased this, there is something wrong with you. You need to get this book. I have read it twice. I have 12 pages of notes, and as I told her before we began tonight, I do presentations on called The Elusive Truth on various methods that are used to deceive us. Today we concentrate on disinformation more, but hers is going to be a valuable resource. So I cannot recommend it high enough, and I am so thrilled she accepted our invitation. She is very busy. She told me she has had 9 online interviews this week, and she did a congressional committee hearing this afternoon. So great thanks. I know you're exhausted, but taking time to share with our members tonight. So thank you. I mentioned, Nina, that I would like you, and excuse me for being so forward calling you by your first name.
Okay, that's okay.
But on an interview I saw with you, you did a nice job of explaining the terms so that our audience can kind of all be on the same wavelength when we're using these terms. So if you could share.
Absolutely. Thank you, Don and Angela. I just want to start by saying that I'm delighted to be with you all tonight. And typically I love to come out and actually, get out of the DC area and meet people in person, share a glass of wine and talk face to face. But since we can't do that, this is the next best thing. And I'm really just delighted to be with you all tonight. So yeah, let's set terms. I think this is really important to do because especially over the last 4 years, as this topic has gotten a lot of attention in the media, as much as I, admire and respect my colleagues in journalism, sometimes they don't quite use these terms with the precision that I would like. So let's talk about it. In the subtitle of my book is Fake News, which has become kind of the colloquial marker for everything that we're talking about tonight. And I want everybody to just strike fake news from your vocabulary. It's not a very helpful term. In fact, we've seen leaders all over the world, from President Trump to Bolsonaro in Brazil, to Viktor Orban in Hungary, to Duterte in the Philippines, start to use that term, fake news, as a pejorative, as something that they use to describe something that's politically inconvenient for them, regardless of the veracity of the information, right? So that's become not a very helpful term. And the other reason it's not helpful is because influence operations and disinformation, which we'll talk about in a little bit, are usually grounded in a kernel of truth. The things that are most effective in terms of influence operations and disinformation actually play on our emotions and our real grievances in society. And I'm sure we'll talk about that in a bit with Don. So fake news, gone forever. No one will ever speak those words again. Disinformation, though, is the use of false or misleading information with malign intent. So that's what Russia does, sometimes what China does. There are also political operatives in the United States who use disinformation. That's different than misinformation. And these are the two that you know, the media loves to interchange. They are not the same thing. Misinformation is when people use false or misleading information or amplify false or misleading information, but they do not have a malign intent behind it. So that's, I always give the example of somebody's crazy aunt or uncle at Thanksgiving who loves conspiracy theories, right? They're not disinforming you, they are misinforming you. So that's the difference there. Then there are a couple other useful terms. We often talk about the hack and leak operation that happened in 2016. We're dealing with a little bit of that again this year. That is, we use the term malinformation to talk about that. So it's information that might be true, but has been publicized, usually through some sort of illicit means, in order to affect or influence a conversation. So malinformation, that one isn't used as much, and most people just say hack and leak. That's totally fine with me as well. And then finally, bots and trolls, often used interchangeably, also not the same thing. So a troll or a troll account is an account that is actually used and operated by a human being. They might have a couple hundred different accounts, but there's one person behind them. So the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, Russia had a lot of troll accounts. There were people behind them typing things, pretending to be, you know, American citizens. That's different than a bot account, which is run by lines of computer code, basically. It is an automated account. There can be networks of these accounts that all tweet or write or comment the same things at same times, but again, they're run by a computer. So you could have thousands and thousands of those accounts tweeting out the same things across the internet on different platforms, but trolls have people behind them. And trolls aren't always, you know, necessarily part of disinformation. Sometimes trolls can just be nasty people on the internet who are hiding behind anonymous accounts. That's kind of the landscape as I see it. But hopefully now we all feel a little bit more equipped to describe the world of online influence operations.
Well, that was excellent. I'll mention before we go on a couple of things. One is that I'm going to go prerogative with Nina until about 6:30, and then we'll do Q&A from the audience. So the chat function at the bottom, many of you that are on here I know have used this before. You can submit then your questions there, and then I will ask Nina, and Angela can jump in and help me as well with that when we get to it. So don't hesitate anywhere along the line to get your questions in. I wanted to mention too, because my next question is going to address what I found one of your real key parts of your book. For those that haven't read it, she looks at Estonia, Georgia, Poland, Ukraine, and the Czech Republic, and what Russia did for disinformation campaigns. Explains in great detail how it really worked, and then most importantly, lessons learned, and then what those countries are doing to combat that, and what the United States might be able to utilize from that. So that's best source I've seen dealing with all of those countries. Is another reason I like your book. But I wanted to concentrate on Estonia because I think that probably is the most successful. As you point out, even though it's a small, you know, population, there still are conceptual ideas I think are valuable. So if you can kind of talk a little bit about Estonia's response.
Sure. Well, Estonia is a pretty fascinating place, despite only having, you know, 1.3 million people. I started going there when I was working for the National Democratic Institute, because it's where our Russia office was. And I had taken an interest in the Baltic states when I was doing my degrees as well. They're just really interesting places ethnically and linguistically. But Estonia is really the kind of beginning of modern Russian information warfare. So Estonia was in the second wave of Euro-Atlantic expansion, joined EU and NATO after countries like Poland did. And it was among the first actual post-Soviet countries that joined the Euro-Atlantic political affiliation. Putin didn't like this, to put it simply. He was not thrilled that a country right on his border could be doing so well, integrating with Europe. Estonia, for those who don't know, created Skype and a lot of the other e-services that we're relying on today. And even in the mid-2000s, when the country first joined the EU and NATO, they were already doing a lot of their governance online. So they were doing all their banking online back then. The only two things that you have to be in person for, like government services in Estonia, are, I believe, getting married and buying property. Everything else you can do online, and that's always been the case. So they've actually done really well during the pandemic because most of their services were able to seamlessly switch to the internet, which is pretty interesting. But that's just an aside. So Estonia was doing really well. Putin went to the Munich Security Conference, which is a big gathering every year, and he gave a fairly bellicose speech talking about how, you know, the Berlin Wall may have come down, but the United States and the Western world order were putting up new walls. And he wanted to knock those down. He wasn't thrilled about that. He said, you know, why are these nations that used to be in my sphere of influence now automatically in your sphere of influence? We should be beyond spheres of influence. And this was an indication to everyone that he was going to start making some trouble. I don't think we took that warning seriously enough, though, because in 2007, looking at, you know, some of the ethnic fissures that existed in Estonian society, where there was a 30% ethnic Russian population left over since the Soviet period, he was able, with the help of his security services, of course, this isn't just Putin the puppet master, right? It's he's working with a large apparatus on his side, to stoke some of those divisions in Estonian society. And all of this came to a head around a statue called the Bronze Soldier that was in the middle of Tallinn. And this was a statue to Soviet war dead. It also was kind of a tomb of the unknown soldier. And it was a place that ethnic Russians would gather on Soviet red letter days like May Day or Victory Day in particular. And it started to become a flashpoint between the ethnic Russians and ethnic Estonians. The ethnic Estonians, frankly, did not view this statue very kindly. In many ways, this kind of debate mirrors the debate that we're having over Confederate statues here in the States. Some people viewed it as, you know, a stain on history, and other people viewed it as something to commemorate. And it became quite violent, and a new government came in and they said, you know what, we're going to move this statue before things get worse, before there are more altercations. We're going to move it to a military cemetery on the outskirts of town, because it was really right smack in the middle of Tallinn, and Tallinn is not a large place. So when there was a protest there or some sort of altercation, it really took over the whole city. And also, you know, the new Estonian government said, this memorial is not something we really want to memorialize anymore. You know, the Soviets repressed our people, and we need to move forward. Of course, the Russians didn't feel too happy about that. They looked back on the Soviet Union with nostalgia. And in the new Estonian society, many ethnic Russians were kind of treated as second-class citizens. They didn't have the same educational opportunities because they didn't speak Estonian, and there weren't any Russian-speaking public universities that they could get into. They were de facto ghettoized in the country, in Russian-speaking neighborhoods and regions. And because of the lack of educational opportunities, they didn't really have any opportunities for career advancement either, at least in the kind of white-collar industry. They were relegated to the service industry. And on top of all of that, unless you could pass an Estonian language exam, you could not get Estonian citizenship. So many of these people had what was called a gray passport, where they weren't an Estonian citizen and they weren't a Russian Federation citizen. They could go between both countries, and I think actually had freedom of movement with the EU as well, but they didn't have a right to vote, and they didn't have the right to get some of the social services that the Estonian government provided. So I'm telling you all of this detail because, again, coming back to how disinformation works, it's built on real grievances. So what did the Russian disinformation in 2007 do? It used the Russian language media, which the Estonian government wasn't investing in any Russian language media. So it was all getting piped over the border from St. Petersburg, which was telling them that they were being ignored by the Estonian government, that the Estonian government, you know, didn't care about their family sacrifices during World War II, et cetera, et cetera. And this led to actually a riot in the center of Tallinn, which was fairly unheard of. In fact, some of my interlocutors told me that, you know, there's more violence in France after a soccer match, than there is in Tallinn on most, you know, days. So this happened, one person died, and then this was all augmented by a round of cyber attacks coming from Russia that were actually almost certainly engineered by a youth organization called Nashi, which might sound familiar because a similar thing has just happened in the United States, dealing with a conservative organization that hired teens to do some of their bidding online. But basically that took down some of the government services, it took down media, it took down banking, and this caused the Estonian government to really take stock and say, we have a real problem on our hands. What can we do about this? And it wasn't just about building up their cyber defenses, although they did. They are now one of the leaders in cybersecurity around the world. They also invested in really backfilling those trust gaps in society, those societal fissures that were being exploited by the Russian Federation in order to foment this unrest. So they invested in Russian language media. They invested in educational opportunities for ethnic Russian populations. I visit in the book one of the Russian language university outposts in a Russian language enclave in Estonia. They invest in integration opportunities, making sure career opportunities are available for people. And they also, this is something that I really love because it's just something that we would never think about in the United States, but you know, they look at the population that is Russian speaking in this town called Narva, which is right on the border with Russia. And they say, what if we actually move the government for a couple weeks a year to Narva to make people understand, you know, we care about you. We understand that you don't feel like we're listening to you. We're going to come and we're going to listen. And it's not just a whistle stop tour. It's not just a campaign stop. It's actual fulsome work going on there. And I like to think about what would happen if, you know, even one bureau of one department went from Washington and took a month and spent it in Peoria, right? What would that look like? How would that change how people view their government? And I don't know if, you know, Estonia can do it, plucky little Estonia. I'm not sure why the United States can't. So looking at those real fissures in society and trying to heal them, I think is something that's critical. And something that we often don't think about when we're thinking about how to respond to disinformation. We talk about the social media platforms, which yes, they definitely have a responsibility. That was what I was talking about in Congress today, primarily. We talk about, you know, pushing back against Russia. Absolutely, we should. We need to draw those red lines, but we also need to look at the things that leave us so vulnerable to manipulation in the first place. And those are the hard, ugly truths about our country that we need to start confronting, frankly, and standing up for.
That's a whole nother program I'd love to do with you sometime is again, how can we, you know, really address, which is a lot of the homegrown disinformation. I know Steve Bannon has said in interviews and profiles that have been done on him that it all began with his gaming thing where he saw this great large number of white, angry young men. And so Bright Bar starts, but then he found out there's a big group of angry, fearful individuals, and especially in the middle of the country that we feel like we are the flyover. And quite frankly, is, you know, the coastal, when I go to DC, they really don't understand people and the rest of the country. Yeah. And how we all address that, I think is I look for you to do more research and give us more ideas. I do want to talk now about the homegrown. That was another one that you did an excellent job of pointing out that there's two types here. There are the ones who are really kind of in the employ of Russia or are knowingly working with them and through agents. And then there are the dupes. The ones who have no idea how they're being manipulated with that. Jill Stein is one. I wasn't in your book, but Jill Stein is one that I'm researched really can't decide if she was a dupe or whether she was actually acting with Russia to draw votes from Hillary Clinton. That's one I'd like to know more about. But can you address some of these people that you had in your book?
Sure. Sorry, we always have a lot of helicopters going over because I'm very close to the Pentagon here in DC. So, Yeah, so homegrown disinformation is something I think that is a huge problem. And one of the big conclusions of the book is, we can't fight foreign disinformation if we aren't fighting domestic disinformation, because of what you just underlined, Don, which is that often people are used either as useful idiots, so they're duped into participating in these operations unwittingly, or there are more willing conduits. So I don't want to give too much oxygen to this crazy conspiracy theory, but I've spent a lot of time in Ukraine. We've heard a lot about Ukraine coming from the president's advisors recently. Even just yesterday, there's a whole new round of allegations coming out that have made their way from untrustworthy sources, unscrupulous sources at best, to Rudy Giuliani, and then laundered into the mainstream media recently. And as somebody who's spent a lot of time in Ukraine, I'm not even going to engage with the substance of those allegations. But just to say, and this is another thing that I told the committee today as well, the people who are feeding this information in many cases have, or at least 2 cases, have already been outed as active Russian agents or having connections to the security services in Russia. And if they're not active Russian agents, then they are incredibly corrupt, self-interested people who are trying to curry favor with the current US administration, which is also very dangerous for our national security. So that's one example of how information laundering has worked. If we're going to connect it more directly to Russia, because I don't want to, we don't know for sure about these most recent allegations, but they do track with everything that Russia has been doing to demean Ukraine and certainly to denigrate democracy here in the United States. There are a couple other interesting examples, I think. One of them in my book, and I don't want to give too much away, but this one's out as an excerpt, so anybody who would search me would find this anyway. I do musical theater in my spare time, which probably doesn't surprise you. I'm using my hands a lot tonight. And when I was living in Ukraine in 2016 and 2017, in July, there were a lot of protests going on back at home. I was seeing them happening on Facebook. One day I was scrolling through and I saw an ad inviting musical theater performers to gather in front of the White House on July 4th, 2017, to sing songs from Les Miserables, the musical, parodies of songs from Les Mis, that were against Donald Trump. And I was like, oh, this is so funny. Theater people gathering together to do a musical theater flash mob against the president. That's hilarious. I'm glad I'm not home right now. And I forgot about it for a long time. And then a little bit over a year later, I got off a plane coming home from a trip abroad, and my phone was blowing up because a criminal complaint had just been unsealed from the Eastern District of Virginia that kind of laid out how the Internet Research Agency worked. It laid out all their financial dealings. It laid out some of the operations that they did. And one of the operations that was detailed in that criminal complaint was one about a Les Mis flash mob outside of the White House in July of 2017. And basically what had happened was the Internet Research Agency saw an active protest group, and rather than create a protest from whole cloth, themselves, they latched onto these folks and they said, hey, we have some money. Do you want to run some ads on Facebook to get more people to your protest? And I found one of the organizers of the protest and interviewed him. And his quote to me that I will never forget was, we're a progressive organization. We have no money unless you are like politicians for killing puppies. We're not going to say no when you offer us some money for Facebook advertising. And this was a pretty successful protest group. They had done a lot of flashy things over the past, couple months since the beginning of the Trump presidency. And the organizers said to me that this was one of their most successful protest actions because of that advertising money. It reached more people than it might have otherwise. And I think this is a really instructive case because it's not only showing that, this goes against the narrative that the Russians only wanted Trump to win. They want chaos, right? They want us to be pitted against one another. They want discouragement and dismay and disengagement from democracy, basically, or at least from the information ecosystem. And that happened on both sides. So that's where Jill Stein becomes relevant. That's where, we know that the Internet Research Agency also targeted the Black Lives Matter movement. as well as, gun rights activists. It's all across the spectrum. And this is the case as well in many other countries. So I think the important thing is that we've recognized the role that we all play in amplifying disinformation, whether it is sharing a post on Facebook, or if we're involved in this sort of activism, or if we're journalists, not doing our due diligence and really, not reaching out and making sure that there's a real American behind the political activities that we're doing or the writing that we're doing. It's incredibly important. And I think we've learned a little bit since 2016, this most recent round of hacked materials or leaked materials that I've been referencing. There's been a lot of caution about reporting about them, and I think that is right until we can confirm where the documents came from and whether they are in fact real documents. So I'll stop there for now. I'm sure you have more questions, Don.
Well, yeah, when we'll run out of time. But as I told you, I knew we would. I mean, I would love to talk with you for hours. But the one thing that you pointed out that Dr. Fiona Hill, during her testimony during the impeachment proceedings, was talking about asked the Congress people to please quit spreading and repeating the Russian disinformation. And of course, most haven't, and they continue on. There also is, and I wanted to point this out, that when I was back years ago doing research, we were talking about whether things like National Enquirer or anything are harmful or not, because really everybody knew that it was fake stuff. However, I met a professor that told me, he says, well, you think it is, but it's not. He says, you may not read it yourself, even though it was the #1 selling at the time. But he says, you go by, see a headline or see something, and you know at that moment that it's from a fake, or special known for fake news and not very likely believable. But then you go 4 or 5 years down the road and you hear about so-and-so running for office, and you go, I heard something somewhere. I don't remember where I heard it. And I think that comes back to the Steve Bannon playbook, which is get it out there and then let's spread it. So even if maybe initially in 4 or 5 years, you just remember that you heard it somewhere and can apply it. So I do worry about that. I know I've got two others that I definitely want to do before we turn it and to our audience. One is, so much of this reminds me of the old novel, The Ugly American. I don't know if you're familiar with it or not. That is a book you should read. But in it, based on the 50s, about in the 1950s with Vietnam and other countries had a fictional nation. But anyway, the point was there was one chapter in there of how to get your propaganda going against the Russians. And so they called it the communist farmer. And so the communists in the community just thought it was parroting, their stories. And so they let it go for the longest time. This reminds me of RT, formerly Russian television. You also mentioned Being Patriot, which was more for the right wing, and Blacktivists for the left wing. And then also the Facebook pages that now have gone private. But especially RT, Sputnik, Being Patriot, and Blacktivists, maybe share with how they build their audiences up first. And you can talk about cat memes, which I love the one I saw you.
Yes, absolutely. So RT is pretty interesting. As Don said, used to be called Russia Today, and then they got smart and rebranded because people realized that, they didn't want to engage with something from Russia, so it's just called RT. And while you might run into RT in like hotel lobbies, or if you're traveling on the hotel TV, sometimes, it'll be on a cable TV package. It actually doesn't have that many viewers on actual TV. Where they get their viewership is online on YouTube. And what they began to do, as YouTube especially was becoming more and more popular in the mid to late 2000s, was they engaged in what a lot of people call disaster porn. So they would buy the rights to something like the tsunami in Japan, somebody's cell phone video of that. Or if you remember the homeless guy with the golden voice in California, all those videos of him. They bought all those videos very quickly. They licensed them, they put them on their page. And those are the sort of kind of clickbaity things, that plus cat videos and, you know, cute animal stuff, that became the core of their most popular videos on YouTube. If you look even today, I'm sure it might have changed a little bit, but none of the top 10 or 20 videos are even political at all. They're just, you know, straight up silly internet junk. And what that does is build trust with people who are, you know, they've maybe seen a video from RT once or twice, the guy with the golden voice or some cute cat video, and that builds a modicum of trust there. And then when RT comes out with more political content, it makes people more likely to trust it. A similar, you know, pattern was used with some of the pages on Facebook. Blacktivist and Being Patriotic are some of them. I always talk about my favorite ad that the Russians bought from the Being Patriotic page. Actually had to do with a dog, and my dog is over here right now.
Oh, yeah.
Love dogs. He always comes to all of my presentations. Anyway, I had to kick him out for the hearing earlier, and he was not pleased about that. Everybody loves dogs, right? Even you know, people who might click on Russian propaganda, and that's exactly the point. They are trying to build trust and build community. So the Being Patriotic page in particular targeted right-leaning people, usually people in Texas in particular, who called themselves patriots, that were very kind of patriotic to jingoistic on the scale, perhaps a little bit, you know, somewhat racist or fearful of immigrants, but in the beginning, all of the stuff that they were putting out there was positive stuff. So this dog, they have a picture of a golden retriever. He's got a red and white star bandana on, and his paws are crossed. He's very well coiffed, you know, recently groomed. Paws are crossed, and he's got a little flag sticking out between his paws, clearly photoshopped, but who cares? It's very cute. And the caption on it says, "Like if you think it's going to be a great week." That's it. No political message, just a dog asking people to engage with the content. And again, that builds that trust over time. So it was this positive message. And then, you know, a couple months later, after a couple months of positive messaging, it would become something like, if you believe that everybody we shouldn't abolish the Second Amendment. I'm just spitballing, but there were gun rights pages. Make sure you change your profile picture on Facebook. So an easy thing for everybody to do. Then a couple months later, it would be sign this petition. And eventually it became turn up to this protest, you know, do this thing in real life off of the internet. And they followed a same pattern on the Black Lives Matter related pages. Blacktivists targeted Black Lives Matter activists and actually had more likes than the actual official Black Lives Matter Facebook page. And again, at the beginning, it was all positive stuff. They were sharing Black history information. They were celebrating contributions of Black Americans to our society. And then gradually it was about changing your profile picture in support of somebody who was recently killed by police, sign a petition, donate some money, turn out to a protest, stay home from voting. We know that there was a lot of voter suppression targeted directly at the Black community. And so this is something I was asked today. Angela and I were talking about this before you all came on. Representative Jim Himes of Connecticut asked me, you know, how do you know that this stuff has an impact on our democracy? Because my assertion in my book and also in my testimony today is that this is a real threat to our democracy. It is actively dismantling our democracy. And I gave him examples about suppressing the Black vote. And I also gave him examples about online harassment that turns into offline violence, including this recent uncovering of a militia plot to kidnap and potentially kill Governor Gretchen Whitmer right next door to you all. And so I think we need to really take this stuff seriously. It's not just some Russian trolls online. This is indoctrinating people. And now the changes that the social media platforms have made over the last 4 years, while they crack down on the Russian propaganda or foreign propaganda, in some ways they're incentivizing the domestic stuff by pushing us into these private and closed groups and recommending some other groups and things that are similar. So just as for instance, and then I'll stop and we can take questions. During the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, I was monitoring a couple of groups in particular was looking at one that was related to anti-vaccination content or like medical freedom content. And Facebook has since kind of changed its interface a little bit, but it used to be that you would go to that group and in the sidebar, you would get recommended a bunch of other groups. So here I am looking at this kind of weird group about medical freedom. And in the sidebar, there is a group about the QAnon conspiracy, which alleges that all the people in power are pedophiles who are involved in human trafficking and satanic worship. And Donald Trump is saving them. That's what the theory alleges. Mueller was also supposed to be involved, but he didn't deliver, so they've erased him from the narrative now. And then there was another one about white supremacist content. And then there was another one about false flag conspiracies, and another one that was more directly anti-vaccination content. So once you're in one of these groups, it's very easy for you to get targeted and pulled into other groups. And it's an easy attack surface for any adversary like Russia or a domestic disinformer who just wants to spread some junk content. You put it in the group, everybody else amplifies it for you because they trust that content. And that's the scariest thing that we have to deal with today. So if any of you are in Facebook groups, just be careful about what you're consuming and interacting with in there.
I've been amazed at the number of people say they get almost all their news from Facebook. And of course, when I was still teaching, I said I don't get any news from Facebook. That's not a source. I want to see the cat memes for me, it's for family and friends to keep up and so on. I've been amazed at what has happened in that area that has become. I think too, when you were saying about whether it has an impact or not, for those of us that have taught and studied psychology and sociology, the whole point is for you not to know you're being manipulated.
Yeah.
That's what advertisers do. That you go to a store and you don't know that you've really been kind of conditioned to buy something because if you go in there knowingly, well, you're not going to do it. And so that, again, there's as you point, the battle for the mind. That's a whole nother program. Very quickly, though, there was one other question I for sure wanted you to talk about was Ukraine and Finland and their education-based disinformation programs.
Sure.
I think I haven't heard that brought up a whole lot, and I wanted our audience to hear about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is one of my big soapbox things. I really think that we have squandered the past couple of years since we had this revelation that disinformation is a problem. We should have immediately started investing more in educating people, not just in educating, K through 12 and university students, but voting age people as well. And there are a lot of mechanisms through which we can do this. Finland focuses it more in their education system. They start media literacy programming with kids at age 5, basically showing them commercials and saying, this is not a cartoon, it's a commercial that's trying to sell you something. From age 5, they get that. I think that's pretty good. And then we also have in Ukraine the use of libraries in particular as a vector of training people. And this is interesting because Ukraine, like the United States, has a very robust public library system. Librarians are highly trusted. They're viewed as non-partisan sources of information. And so an American NGO called IREX, with some seed money from, I think, the Canadians and the Brits at the beginning, and now the US government has also signed on to it, trained a bunch of librarians, I think 10,000 librarians across the country, in a robust counter-disinformation curriculum. So how to identify disinformation, what are the signs that you're being emotionally manipulated, how to evaluate a source, how to deal with, hate speech on the internet, really, really wide and robust. And those 10,000 librarians went and trained a bunch of other people in their libraries, who then trained more people and talked to them about the curriculum. They also had a bunch of public service announcements that might reach people who weren't at the trainings. So they would say things like, information is a product, consume wisely. And it would show a woman going with a shopping cart in the store and looking at a nutrition label that was, related to information, and just showing her considering the different options, which I think is a smart way to talk about your news diet as well. And people who saw those public service announcements were much more likely, after seeing or hearing them in the metro or on the radio, to double check a source after they saw it. And the follow-on tests for the people who were in the training at the libraries showed that even 18 months later, people were retaining the skills that they learned there. So there are a lot of people who say, okay, media literacy sounds nice, but we need something that's going to fix this problem now. And as I think I've hopefully all convinced you, we can't just, play whack-a-troll and delete things off the internet. Frankly, that's not the American way, right? And we can't just, hermetically seal our information environment from Russia or anyone else who wants to come in. We have to give people the tools they need to navigate this information environment, this unprecedented flow of information, and frankly, help them train the reflexes so that the same way we get a call and someone's asking for our social security number and we know that's not the real deal, we need to develop those same reflexes for bad information on the internet. And I think that is something that is well within, the capacity of the government through Department of Education grants based on a nonpartisan curriculum, through our libraries and our National Endowment for the Humanities, through civil society organizations and journalists, and also the platforms have a role to play here as well too, right? These are multi-billion-dollar corporations with nearly ubiquitous access to most Americans' lives. What could they do if they turned those resources on for good rather than just for profit? So I'll leave you with that thought tonight before we get to Q&A.
Well, you and I had talked about the frustration that we have, that a lot of people they don't know the difference between opinion and facts. And so I think that's been another headache for us here in the United States. As I pointed out to you as an observer, I'm a centrist, so I'm not, blindly follow a certain ideology. So I obviously look at things differently. But I think like CNN, I think is almost all opinion now, that they really have gone away from virtually any news. MSNBC, it's hard to find in the United States now, except for the NewsHour, like we were talking, really a TV, a media news source, and getting people on track to what are considered by most people, whether it's left, right, that are not ideologues. I think that is a struggle, and that brings us kind of to Dottie's question here. How do you talk to a friend who believes a conspiracy theory which is false information?
This is the million-dollar question. So the main thing that I would suggest is to make sure that you're doing it in a private one-to-one location rather than just in the comments. My mom does this all the time. I actually asked her this the other day. She was in a fight with somebody who was one of my dad's childhood friends. And they were arguing about, I think, something to do with the Supreme Court confirmation hearings. And she said she was going back and forth with him in the comments. And she was like, well, what should I do? And I was like, well, first of all, you should move it offline. And she was like, but then no one will see it. And I was like, well, Mom, do you want to change his mind or do you want to win the argument? And she said, I want to win the argument. And I was like, well, I can't help you then. But if you really do want to change a person's mind, I suggest picking up the phone or typing it in a private message, because people are a lot more likely to engage with you that way, first of all. They're not going to just dig their heels in and try to defend their turf, especially because there's not a risk of public embarrassment, right? The second important principle is to not come at it immediately trying to fact check or debunk them, which I know is hard, but you want to say something like, hey, I saw you share this article. I was wondering what made that information appealing to you. I was wondering why you decided to share it. I'm just curious. What do you think is interesting about it? And then that at least clues you into what drew them to it. And you can say, okay, just using QAnon as an example, you're concerned about child trafficking. It's a real problem. It's something that's definitely scary. And I agree with you that it's something we need to stop. But just so you know, this is the reality of child trafficking. This, particular protest has been constructed in order to, and then you can kind of go on and tease out the intellectual bits of it. But I think the longer you can stay in that exchange of actual views rather than getting to the fact checking part, and kind of understanding where people are coming from. That's the best way to really get at those theories. And it can be hard. I mean, it's really frustrating. I have a cousin, my cousin's wife is you know, into the QAnon thing. She's not super into it, but she shared something on Instagram once, and I reached out to her, and she ended up, you know, unfollowing me. But it's something that can be iterative and take a long time, and takes a lot of perseverance, but is worth doing if you approach it that way. If you just want to dig in and win an argument, then just keep it in the comments and realize that you probably won't change anybody's mind. But as long as that's what you're okay with, like my mom, then be my guest. I don't know.
Well, you might be like me. I found that, like lemmings, that in fact they do not follow off the ledge. In fact, the person who did the film on that actually pushed them off, drove them off. And so there's a myth that we continue to believe, and I don't care how often I go over that, the corn and popcorn for subliminal. First off, it ended up, finally, when you're done researching, the guy finally admitted he didn't even do the experiment.
Yeah.
And so in psychology, we've taught that for years, and then, you know, find out, well, change somebody's mind after they've heard that forever. They may agree with you at the moment, but they go right back to using that right away. So that's a frustration I find on arguing. Barb has a point and a question that was one, Barb, that I have down to ask as well. Both Barb and I think that Russia wouldn't even have to interfere in anything any longer, given the division and the partisanship that is going on. We've seen with these militia groups, as you pointed out with QAnon. You have the individual at the pizza restaurant in DC who believed, and so went in with his gun, just firm, and then he believes he just had gotten misinformation. He doesn't believe that it wasn't true, you know. So does Russia? Would they be fine just sitting this at one completely out?
Yeah, I told the committee something similar today. I mean, I don't think they're sitting completely out because we have a variety of evidence of things that have been going on this year, but it looks different, right? They don't have to create as much. They don't have to use that brute force the same way that they did. They just have to amplify pre-existing divisions, and that was always true to some extent, but we have so many more and much more polarized divisions than we had 4 years ago. The same thing was true in Ukraine last year. In 2019, I was there covering the election that brought Volodymyr Zelensky, the comedian president who became unfortunately famous because of impeachment, to power. It was a very rancorous election between President Poroshenko, the incumbent, and Zelensky, and everyone was there looking for signs of Russian interference, but they didn't need to create it. They didn't need to do it because Ukraine was doing it to itself. They even had, Ukraine is very much the audition tactics for our elections 2 years in a row now. They even had the candidates asking each other to take drug tests. Then I should have been worried that was going to come home when that happened here.
That's very, very true. Angela has another great question here. Has the internet created a sense of anonymity that allows people to be far more mean, rude, and willing to take what some may consider outrageous stance? Let me add to that, Angela. And does it also allow somebody like me, I hate to admit this, but if I did not have a conscience or a moral code, I would be excellent to work for the Internet Research Agency or these groups. I can come up with the most believable nonsense that there is. And I've done that in the past, but as a joke. But being anonymous or making money, I mean, I really think, wow, that'd be an opportunity if I didn't have that moral code. So what about the anonymity?
Yeah, the anonymity is a huge problem. And frankly, it allows people, they feel the levity to harass other people, to threaten other people, to say horrible things that they would never say, and also to organize plenty of campaigns that, actually have an effect on people's day-to-day lives, whether that's gendered harassment or things related to political issues, as we've seen. I'm tracking, as part of an ongoing project at the Wilson Center, some of the gendered and sexualized narratives that are used deliberately and in an organized way against women on both sides of the political spectrum by various parties, but men are usually the culprits, that are meant to keep women out of public life, frankly. And this is something that Kremlin has also used, but anonymity helps that. Now, that being said, I used to work with activists in places like Ukraine and Russia and Belarus, and if we eliminated anonymity on social media, it would also clamp down on a lot of the possibilities for free expression in authoritarian states that those people aren't allowed when, you know, they are required to have their name attached to their opinions online. And in fact, in places like Russia, people are routinely thrown in jail for things that they post on social media. So I'm also not convinced that changing the anonymous structure of the internet necessarily helps. Something that Brazil has looked at is requiring you to connect your social media profiles with your kind of national profile. There are some issues with that as well, because who's going to be the steward of that data if it's connected to, for instance, to your social security card or your driver's license. We know that many of these platforms have had data breaches before. Twitter was just recently hacked over the summer. So who's holding on to that data? Is it the government? Is it the platforms? How do they talk to each other? If the government knows who's who, how do they use that to crack down on people? It all gets very murky very quickly. So that's why when I get like terrible trolling online, I try to engage with people again on that personal level. I always invite them to message me if they'd like to message me. And then if it feels like they're still not engaging in good faith, then I turn that off. And then remind me, Don, what was the second part of the question? I've now forgotten. I went on a long tangent.
And I think that was mine, so don't worry about it.
Okay.
Yeah, there was another point I wanted to point out to the audience that you've covered before, but and that just slipped out of my mind as well. I did want to say, though, that a lot of this stuff isn't new. Oh, I know what it was. You know, Russia didn't really didn't have to come up with anything new. They just amplified already. So that goes back to Barb's point. We've got so much of it going on. But another thing is, and I'm sure this happens to you. Now, again, for me as a centrist, most of my relatives and friends are on the right. And so if I say anything that tries to give fair balance, I'm a liberal. If I say something that is such as Barack Obama, one of the things that we know now is that they were very slow to do a lot of actions. So if I point that out in the decision making, this is what a lot of the experts, the people around have said, well, that's because you're a Republican, you're a conservative. And so I'm immediately dismissed by either people who are right on the left by just trying to lay out what is the factual information we know right now. Well, no, because you're attacking my person. So I'm sure you run into that. Also, this is nothing new in history. We've seen both the partisanship, which was horrible during the beginning of our country, worse, I would say, than even today, hard to believe. And also, Tim Weiner just has a book out, The Folly and the Glory. I don't know if you're aware of it, but he pointed out that Russia wanted to help Adlai Stevenson. Stevenson thought they were going to offer and immediately cut off the Russian ambassador, did not let him make the offer. They did make the offer to John F. Kennedy, and Kennedy said, I would prefer that you not interfere. And as he points out, if they're not Democrat or Republican, it's just right now it's Republican that they're trying to help.
Yeah.
But they are doing stuff on the left to stir things up as well. So we're always looking, as you said, the false equivalency of balance. Well, the other side's doing it too. Well, yeah, but right now there's one group, other points in our history, it has been the other side. We could point that out, the argument's over for them. So I don't know, do you run into that as well?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds, John, like you're doing a good job. If you're angering people on both sides, that's usually what I
Yeah,
think.
they all accuse me of being on the other side.
Yeah, well, and then throw in, if you're me, I always get accused of being CIA because people don't want to.
Well, that's obvious. I mean, everything is it's either Russia or the CIA.
Exactly. Sometimes I'm both on the same day, which I think is pretty funny. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot more partisanship than there used to be. And frankly, we need to be able to work together. And the internet, because of the way these social platforms work, they incentivize very emotional, enraging content. They are not incentivizing the nuanced takes, right? They're not pushing them forward in the feed and showing them to you. They're just showing you the stuff that's going to make you mad or happy, although that doesn't seem possible this year. So that's where we're at, and we need to change those incentive structures on the internet. And I think that we will return to a little bit more of that civil discourse, although I hate using that because everybody who's clamoring for civil discourse often is part of the problem in terms of the language and things like that they use. But we need to not feed into that as much as we can, because that's exactly what our adversaries are trying to use. That's exactly what they are amplifying. And we just need to go back to having normal conversations again, which is easier said than done when you're being primed to react in an emotional way.
Let me ask you, Nina, I've got 2 minutes left here, but I've got 4 questions that if I can I hold you maybe 5 minutes extra?
Yeah, of course.
All right. We'll try, your answer short. One of them here is, should we get off Facebook? And I did see the German Marshall Fund points out that Facebook activity has doubled since 2016.
Should we get off Facebook? I am pretty against people getting off Facebook. I myself have not deleted my account. That is mostly for research reasons, and also because the places I study, like Ukraine, Facebook is so ubiquitous. If you try to send someone a normal text message there, they'll respond on Facebook Messenger because it's free for them. And so even if every American were today to get off Facebook, there would still be a giant market for Facebook outside of the United States. Most Facebook users are in India, actually. And the other fastest growing markets are the Philippines and Ukraine. So it's used as a primary means of communication in many, many other places around the world. And we kid ourselves if we are thinking that we have that much pressure on the platform. In fact, even when Facebook's biggest advertisers pulled out over the summer during the Stop Hate for Profit campaign, where they were saying, Facebook, you shouldn't be taking money for hateful, untrue advertising. That didn't really even generate any change, even though, again, some of those biggest advertisers pulled all their Facebook ads for months. Again, incentive structures really need to change. I don't think you need to get off Facebook as long as you are being skeptical of your information, practicing informational distancing. So if you feel yourself getting upset at something you're reading, that's a good chance you're being emotionally manipulated. Close your computer, put your device down, take a little walk. If you still are thinking about that after a couple minutes, what I then recommend, my brain is really rapidly deteriorating right now. What I recommend is that you then do some cross, referencing. I'm sure you're all well familiar with how to do that. But one of the best things on Facebook that I'm seeing a lot, so sometimes people will share screenshots of posts these days. They'll just show somebody else's post. You can't copy and paste it. The best thing you can do in those cases is just type a couple of the words from the post, like something that would be identifiable, and stick it in the search bar. See if anything else comes up. You might be able to find the earliest instance of that post. So something like this happened to me over the summer. I think it was over the summer. There was like a very incendiary post that was being attributed to Dr. Fauci. It was very political. I read it and I was like, this doesn't seem like something Dr. Fauci said. So I searched for it in the box and I saw the first person who said it. And actually she had put an addendum on her post that said, people are saying Dr. Fauci wrote this. No, it's my Facebook post. I wrote it, but people had just misattributed it. So you need to be able to do some of that due diligence. Another thing that I suggest everyone learn how to do is a reverse image search. So if you know how to use Chrome, the Chrome browser, it's built into your browser. Basically, you can just right click on any image and click search Google for image. And that will show you the similar images to it on the internet, and usually it will show you the earliest instance of that image on the internet. So one of the things that is helpful in that case is if you're encountering a faked picture that's been debunked or a picture that's been misattributed. Often Russia in particular will use pictures from like the Balkan conflict to describe Ukraine right now. We see that similar things in fringe media here. In Washington every year when the Potomac floods after a hurricane, there's always a picture of a shark swimming in the Potomac. This was a great way to debunk that. You just right click and see, oh, okay, this has been debunked. There are no sharks in the Potomac. So I encourage you to learn how to do that as well. It's a great way to verify your information, but you don't need to get off Facebook. If you're getting value from connecting with your friends and family there, seeing baby pictures, dog pictures, stay on there by all means.
And I say skim past the rest of the stuff. I try to tell my wife to do that, but she has to stop and get herself upset. I said, I just skim by it. All I look for. But anyway, easier for some. Another question here from Larry is, do you have a process for identifying when you are being presented misinformation, given the massive amount of information that's presented out there?
Yeah, so I think for everyday use, what I've just described is what I'll go through. A couple more signs, especially if you're off a social media platform, if you're on some random website, is you look and see if they have a contact us page with an actual address and phone number, not just a form that goes who knows where into the internet. See if they have a masthead with real names on it that connect to other places on the internet. So do they have an editor-in-chief? Who is the journalist that's written this story? Has that journalist written other articles that are, trustworthy, or are they all similarly incendiary? Those are all good indications. And then some of the stuff that I've already talked about. The other stuff that you can do is kind of look through hashtags if you're on Twitter. They're not as useful on Facebook, but basically this is a way to talk about what's trending. Sometimes people will mark their posts with a hashtag. But that gets into like a broader network analysis that I think most people don't have the time or inclination or sometimes skills to do, because it requires kind of going through massive amounts of data. But the most important thing is if you feel yourself getting emotional, just recognize you might be being manipulated and think to yourself, why would this source want to manipulate me? What's in it for that source? Whoever it might be, whatever it might be.
All right, and final question here from Joshua. Was struggling why people in a village where he is living or from believed in witchcraft beliefs and practice it. It's again just these conspiracy theories or these beliefs. I go all the way back to the John Birch Society.
Mm-hmm.
I'm old, and I used to make up communist conspiracy theories, and they would actually believe them and take them back to their meetings. That's where I got my start with it, because they were so scared of communism. But yeah, do you want to address a little bit why we're so susceptible to these kind of belief systems?
Yeah, and why these things are coming back. I think especially during the pandemic, people are looking for a sense of community. They're looking for a sense of comfort. They're looking to make sense of something that's really difficult to understand and we don't have a lot of answers to. And so that's where these conspiracies and kind of occult beliefs kind of come in. And we're seeing, especially with the pandemic, so many snake oil cures on the internet, especially at the beginning. There's one guy that I did an expose on a fake news ring he was running during the 2018 midterms, and he's now turned to medical misinformation very easily from one kind of conspiracy to another. And one of the things that he encouraged his followers to do was take a blow dryer and aim it down your throat to kill the coronavirus. I mean, people are looking for anything, right, that they think might help, because we don't know. We're getting more information now, but we didn't know so much at the beginning. And I think there's a lot of that sense with other things that we're dealing with in our society as well. And that's why we're seeing these beliefs returning. And I think the sense of community is big for some people too, who have been kind of isolated, not only during the pandemic, but perhaps by job loss or things like that. They're looking for something, and the internet provides that something. And we the internet can be extremely positive. You know, it's brought down governments. It has shown light on corruption. But right now it's not being used for that good. It's being used to bring out the worst in many, many people. And so I think, again, that changing that incentive structure, not only away from the occult, away from things that are conspiracies, but also, you know, incentivizing the good in people, and making it so that this tool can actually serve our democracies instead of denigrate them.
I want to throw in real quick for Joshua as well. I used a video called With the Amazing Randy, and where he would talk about a lot of these schemes over in Russia. The psychics were really big, and why people believe in that. And he shared with about a friend who was working his way through college, and he went into palm reading, and he knew it was all fake. Well, he learned it, but after a while, he goes, "Randy, this stuff is true. It really works. I read their palms, and it all comes true." And so he said, "All right, next time go and tell them the exact opposite of what you're seeing on there." And he came back, it all came true. So it's what we want to believe so often, and ghost, you know, whatever it is. That's, again, the psychology, sociology. We know why, but trying to convince people is another story. Well, we had to leave tons of stuff out. We didn't get it. We could have gotten into deep fakes, which is another nightmare coming on the scene as well. And but yes, there's tons of stuff in Nina's book that you need to read. One final point that we didn't get into that I wanted to share with the audience before we do leave is that in the last election, I believe it's David Schimmer's book, Rigged, talked about that the government really was looking more that they were going to change the vote totals. They were going to hack in. And so they had their eyes completely on them messing something up where then you could claim, you know, voter fraud, and it may not have been enough to change, but it was enough to change people's perceptions. And they weren't looking for the social at all. So both sides are an issue of what they might pull. And lastly, I would love to talk to you sometime. I see after the election, Russia having a gold mine with either Democrats or however the election turns out. I can see them. I'm scared that I could see armed violence taking place and them stirring.
I know that's something that's really been worrying me a lot as well, especially as somebody who has served on election monitoring missions in other countries. I'm very disturbed by the recruitment for party poll watchers that the Trump campaign has been doing, and this isn't partisan at all. Every party is allowed to have poll watchers at the polls, but we shouldn't be militarizing the recruitment of them, as the Trump campaign has been doing, particularly when we know there are some armed people who might kind of go crazy in these scenarios. It's a very scary thing for me, and something that I think international election observers are definitely going to be watching for. You mentioned deep fakes. I'm actually not as worried about deep fakes as everyone else. I am optimistic on deep fakes because the tech community and our military are actively working on solutions for them, which we can't say for social media. And then I saw in the chat, Barb had a follow-up question. Do we anticipate Russia will interfere with computer counting or any way else? So I've talked and briefed to a number of state secretaries of state who run our elections. I think they are taking more precautions this year. They have been, gaming this all out to make sure that their cybersecurity is up to snuff. One interesting thing about cybersecurity, though, is that it's not, you can have the best IT system in the world. It's about people. It's about social engineering and getting people to give up their passwords or personal information that allow the bad guys to get in. So that's something we do have to worry about. But that being said, I think our election system is, in terms of the actual infrastructure, stronger than ever because we've been paying so much attention to it. Could it be stronger if Congress, pardon my French, got off its ass and actually passed some bills related to election security? Yes, it could be much better. This shouldn't be politicized. I have hope that it will all start to move soon. So that's one thing, but everybody should not fear that your vote's going to get counted freely and fairly, at least, in the confines of the infrastructure being safe. So you shouldn't worry about that. The social aspect, yeah, there's already been a couple Russian campaigns taken down. Thankfully, there is more cooperation between our law enforcement and intelligence agencies and the social platforms than there used to be. It's still not where it should be. It's still not where it could be if we had bipartisan cooperation about this stuff and a bipartisan consensus that this is something we need to stop. But it's better than it was. That being said, you know, I think more is going to come out. And since we have this long tail on the election post November 3rd, you know, it's almost certain that we're not going to have results within a couple of days, which is normal and fine in this situation. It's not anti-democratic. That leaves a lot of room for uncertainty, and, you know, either misleading news stories to come out. One thing we were talking about at an event earlier today is what would happen if, you know, one of the main news organizations had their website hacked and fake information was posted there. One of the more trusted news organizations, that would have massive effects. There was also a Twitter hack, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, earlier over the summer, that was just done for economic reasons. People were trying to harvest Bitcoin, this internet currency. But imagine what could happen if people's accounts, who are, you know, reputable sources of information, state secretaries of state, et cetera, if their accounts were hacked. There's a lot of possibilities. And then there's the possibility of a hack and leak happening after the election as well, to throw more chaos into the system. So what I'm telling everybody is, from November 3rd onward, from 8 p.m. on November 3rd onward, as much as you can, really try not to engage with the news industry. I would say going to public media is probably your best source of news. And then when you can cut out the news entirely and just go to your state secretary of state, your local election board, those sources that are the official sources, not politicians, not pundits, that's going to be your best source of information after the election, because there will be all sorts of people, Russia, China, Iran, we know this already, plus the you know, partisan folks who are trying to stir things up. And then one final thing, I dropped a link in the chat to my publisher's website. You can get 30% off my book with the code that I dropped in there. So if that's interesting to you, please feel free. And there's also, if you want to pay full price, a store in Arlington, Virginia, let me just get you the link, that it has signed copies of the book, if that's interesting to you. Some people care about that, but that supports a local bookstore as well. So I'll just drop that, which you won't be able to get the discount there though, because that's only through my my publisher. But
that gets out. Yeah. Well, before Angela, before I turn it over to you, I want to give a special thanks, Nina, and giving us you've had such a busy week, and to give us this extra time, I very much appreciate it.
Delightful. I loved chatting with you.
And hopefully we'll be physically in DC next year for our World Affairs Council of America National Conference. This year is virtual. And if I'll be there for about a week. I hope that we might find time that you're available. I can buy you lunch or dinner to show you also appreciation, and also let you give me the latest update. So
I would love that. Thank you very much.
And everybody, it's a great Christmas gift too, the book. So keep that in mind for
Thank
friends.
you.
All right, Angela.
Thanks, everyone.
You've got several people showing their appreciation with claps, so thank you. And a quick question on the book: if we order it through your publisher, those are not signed though, correct?
They are not signed, yeah.
Okay.
So only through one more page are they signed. The Bloomsbury ones, they might get shipped from England, I'm not sure.
Okay. All right, no, that's good to know. Thank you so much. This was a wonderful presentation this evening. I am delighted that you were able to join us on behalf of the Peoria Area World Affairs Council. Thank you very much for giving us a great deal to think about. And
hopefully not too depressing.
I don't think so, actually. I thought it was quite hopeful that you've given us a kick in the butt to do our due diligence and look at information and cross-reference it and check it out before we just plunge in. As we were chatting before we started, I shared with her that I said, the person who started QAnon, I wonder if this guy just sat in his living room and thought, what's the craziest, most insane, wild thing I could say and see if people will still believe it. And then it took off from there. He wasn't even close with his first crazy statement. So on behalf of the Peoria Area World Affairs Council, an organization that enjoys civil discussion with enlightening ideas and enjoying experts who are willing to share their expertise with us, thank you very much.
It was my pleasure.
Good deal. Don't forget, everybody, we've got a program with Ambassador William Lewis next week, next Friday. He is a student of Iran, so he has been ambassador all over the place, but in his retirement, he has become an intensive student of all things Iran. So next Friday, join us for that. Good night, everybody. Good night, Ms. Jankowicz. Everybody have a great weekend. Go watch one of the town halls and see if anything new comes up. But do exercise your right to vote, please.
I'm going to go read The Onion. Yeah,
Probably a better use of your time. Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you so much.
all right, get some rest.
Good
Thank
night.
you.
Very good presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you.
I've lost my button. Now I've got it.
Okay. All right. Thanks,
All right.
Angela.
Good night, everybody.